At 31 weeks pregnant, I went to Vale Medical's charity gala for one reason. I needed to meet the person who claimed my ex-fiancé had never received my pregnancy records. I never reached them. A contraction folded me beside the orchestra pit, and the fetal monitor they rushed in began skipping every fourth beat. Then she walked through the crowd. Dr. Adrienne Vale, the ice-cold alpha cardiologist who had ended our engagement and signed away every right to my baby. "Don't let her touch me," I told the nurses. Adrienne stopped an arm's length away. "Then I won't, but please let me listen." The heartbeat filled the ballroom. Every trace of color vanished from her face. "That rhythm," she whispered. "Only my family carries it." I held up the papers bearing her signature. "You said this child wasn't yours." Her eyes snapped to mine. "Lena, I was told the transfer failed." Then the monitor screamed, and my phone displayed one final message from the missing whistleblower. "Don't trust a Vale. Not even her. I want to take you back 20 minutes, before the ballroom, before the monitor, before I understood how much I still didn't know about the woman I had once promised to marry." I had arrived at Vale Medical Center's annual benefit alone, in a dress that no longer fit the way it had 6 months earlier, carrying a folder I hoped never to need. A source calling herself Only J had reached out through my newsroom account 3 weeks before, claiming that someone inside Vale Medical had intercepted a set of my private pregnancy records before they ever reached Adrienne. I hadn't believed it at first. I had built my career on not believing things until they were proven. But Jay had sent me a single scanned document, a shipping confirmation for a records transfer that Adrienne's clinic never logged as received, and something about the precision of it kept me awake for 3 nights straight. I told myself I was only there as a journalist. I told myself the gala, the chandeliers, the string quartet playing something soft and expensive meant nothing to me. I told myself I would find Jay, get my confirmation, and leave before Adrienne Vale ever knew I had been in the building. I hadn't planned on my body disagreeing with me. The first contraction hit as I was scanning the crowd for anyone who looked like they were watching me instead of the room. It doubled me over near the edge of the dance floor, hard enough that my champagne glass shattered against the marble. I heard someone call for a doctor, before I even registered the sound as my own voice. I did not expect the doctor who came. I heard her before I saw her, the particular authority, in a voice that used to say my name like it was something worth protecting. Adrienne Vale moved through that crowd the way she moved through everything, calm on the surface, controlled at the center, alpha command wrapped so tightly around her that most people stepped aside without knowing why. She saw me on the floor and stopped as if she'd walked into glass. I do not know what she saw in my face, but she did not come closer. "Don't let her touch me," I said to the nurse, crouching beside me, loud enough that Adrienne would hear it too. I watched something in her expression fold in on itself. She raised both hands slightly, an old habit from her training, the universal gesture of a doctor, promising she would not force anything. "Then I won't," she said, "but please, let me listen." I don't know why I nodded. Maybe it was the pain. Maybe it was 31 weeks of being afraid alone. Maybe some part of me still trusted the sound of her voice more than I trusted the rest of her. She knelt at a careful distance while the nurse placed the monitor. She did not reach for me. She reached only for the small speaker, adjusting it with hands that I remembered shook slightly whenever she cared about something more than she wanted to admit. The heartbeat filled the ballroom, fast and small and unmistakably alive. I watched every trace of color leave Adrienne's face. "That rhythm," she said, so quietly I almost missed it under the music that hadn't yet stopped. "Only my family carries it." I had spent 2 years building a wall around what she meant to me. It came down in that instant, and behind it was only fury. I held up the folder with shaking hands, the papers with her signature surrendering every parental right to a child she had, until that moment, apparently never known existed. "You said this child wasn't yours," I said. Her eyes came up to mine, and for the first time in 2 years, I saw something in them I didn't recognize. Not guilt, not deflection, genuine, bottomless confusion. "Lena," she said, "I was told the transfer failed." The monitor screamed before I could answer her, the rhythm spiking into something dangerous, and in the chaos that followed, my phone lit up on the floor beside me with one final message from the whistleblower I had come there to find. "Don't trust Avail, not even her. They got me into a private recovery suite on the 3rd floor within minutes, the kind of speed that only happens when the hospital's name is on the building and the patient's collapse happened in front of 300 donors. I remember fluorescent light, and the particular indignity of being examined by strangers while the woman who broke my heart stood just outside the glass, arguing quietly with someone in scrubs. The contractions slowed once they got fluids into me. The obstetrician on call, a calm woman named Dr. Osi, told me my body had likely been running on stress and too little sleep for weeks, and that the baby, for now, was stable. For now, I held onto those 2 words like a life raft. Adrienne was allowed in only after I said her name. I want to be honest about that, because I think it matters. She did not push her way through. She waited to be invited, the way she had waited outside the ballroom. She stood near the door, hands loosely folded, alpha posture gone soft and uncertain, in a way I had rarely seen from her even during our engagement. "I need you to understand something," she said. "I did not know you were pregnant until I heard that heartbeat." "You signed papers," I said. "Papers with your name on them, releasing every claim to a child." "Adrienne, I have had that document in a drawer for 6 months. I have read it more times than I can count." "I never signed anything releasing a child," she said. "I signed papers ending our engagement. I signed papers acknowledging that our final embryo transfer had failed, because that is what I was told. If there is a document claiming I relinquished parental rights to a living child, I am telling you, under oath if I have to, that I have never seen it before tonight." I wanted to believe the venom in my own certainty more than I wanted to believe her. It would have been easier. But I have spent 9 years as an investigative journalist learning to read the difference between a person defending a lie and a person discovering one. And something in the rigid, careful way she was holding herself told me this was the second thing. "Then who signed it?" I said. "I don't know," she said, "but I intend to find out." I told her about Jay. I told her about the shipping confirmation, the intercepted records, the message that had just told me not to trust her. I watched her go very still when I mentioned her mother's name in the same breath, not because I had accused Evelyn Vail of anything yet, but because Adrienne's face did the accusing for me before I finished the sentence. "Tell me about Jay," she said carefully. "How did this source first contact you?" "Through my newsroom's secure tip line," I said. "No name, no photo, just an encrypted account and a single document. I get dozens of tips a month that go nowhere. This one felt different. The person writing to me knew details about hospital records procedure that a random tipster wouldn't know. Timestamps. Internal form numbers. The kind of specificity that comes from working inside a system, not reading about it." "Did they ever suggest a department?" Adrienne asked. "Compliance," I said. "They mentioned compliance twice." Adrienne closed her eyes briefly. "My mother's department." "I know how that sounds," I said. "I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm telling you what I have." "You don't need to soften it for me," she said, and there was an edge in her voice that wasn't directed at me. "I have spent my entire career pretending my mother's department was simply thorough. Efficient. I told myself the reason everything ran so smoothly under her was competence, not control. I think some part of me has known for years that competence was never the whole story, and I chose not to look closer because looking closer would have cost me things I wasn't ready to lose. My research funding. My standing on the board. The version of my family I preferred to believe in. It was the first time she had admitted that discomfort to me directly, and it landed harder than I expected. I had spent 2 years assuming Adrian's silence about our relationship's collapse meant indifference. Sitting across from her in that hospital room, I began to understand it might have meant something closer to fear. "My mother runs medical records compliance personally for this wing," she said slowly. "She has, since the merger. Nothing moves through that department without her signature on the audit log." Neither of us said anything else for a long moment. The heart monitor from the fetal unit down the hall was still audible faintly through the wall, a small, fast rhythm that belonged, apparently, to both of us now, whether either of us had chosen it or not. "I am not asking you to forgive me for 2 years you believe I chose," Adrian finally said. "I am asking you to let me help you find out what actually happened. After that, you can decide what I am to you. But right now, our daughter's heart carries a pattern that has put 3 people in my family into surgery before the age of 10. I need to know what she is dealing with, and I need to know now." I hated how much sense that made. I hated that some small, exhausted part of me was relieved she was there. I said yes because the baby needed it, I told myself. Only because of that. Dr. Osei brought in an independent specialist within the hour, a soft-spoken cardiologist named Marcus Feld, who had no history with either of our families and no stake in whatever Evelyn Vale controlled. He reviewed the monitor strips, then asked Adrian, almost casually, whether the Vale cadence had a formal diagnosis attached to it. "Familial long QT variant," Adrian said. "Benign in most carriers. Dangerous during acute stress in a small percentage. We won't know until we run a full echo which category she falls into." "We," Feld repeated, glancing between us. Neither of us corrected him. Once the immediate danger passed, Feld left us with printouts and a plan for the following morning. Adrian stayed a while longer, standing near the window with her back to me, the city lights sharp against the dark glass. "I want to show you something," she said, and pulled a folder from her bag, an old-fashioned physical folder in an era when almost everything at Vale Medical lived on a server. "This is the correspondence I received 8 months ago, the one telling me our final transfer failed." I read it twice. The letterhead was correct. The signature block matched the clinic's format exactly, but the date stamp in the corner, when I held it up to the light, showed a faint double impression, as though it had been printed once, altered, and printed again. "Someone changed this," I said. "I know," Adrian said. "I didn't know 8 months ago. I know now, because I am looking at it beside you instead of alone. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the hospital bed, listening to the small, fast rhythm of my daughter's heart on the monitor, and I thought about how easily 2 women who had loved each other could be turned into strangers by nothing more than a few altered documents and a family with enough power to make sure no one asked the right questions. I decided, somewhere around 3 in the morning, that I was going to ask the right questions anyway. Before I go further, I want to tell you who I was before that night, because it matters for what came after. I had spent 9 years building a reputation as a journalist who did not flinch from powerful families. I had taken down a city councilman for zoning fraud. I had spent 11 months tracing a pharmaceutical kickback scheme that ended with 2 executives in federal custody. I was good at my job precisely because I did not let sentiment cloud a paper trail. And yet, for 2 years, I had let a single signature convince me that the woman I loved most in the world had walked away from a child without a second thought. I had not investigated my own heartbreak the way I investigated everything else. I had grieved it instead, filed it away, and told myself that some pain does not deserve scrutiny, only distance. Lying in that hospital bed, listening to my daughter's heartbeat on the monitor, I understood that I had made the one mistake I never allowed my sources to make. I had accepted a convenient story instead of chasing an inconvenient truth. I would not make that mistake twice. Adrian and I had met 4 years earlier at a medical ethics conference where she was presenting research on inherited arrhythmias in pediatric patients, and I was covering a panel on hospital billing transparency for an entirely unrelated story. I remember the way she answered a hostile question from an older cardiologist in the audience. Calm, precise, unwilling to raise her voice even as the man tried to bait her into losing her composure. I remember thinking that anyone who could stay that steady under pressure either had nothing left to lose or had already lost the ability to feel anything at all. It took me 8 months of careful, patient friendship to learn it was neither. Adrian felt everything. She had simply been raised in a family that treated visible emotion as a liability, something that made you easy to predict and therefore easy to control. Her mother, Evelyn, ran both the hospital system and the family with the same philosophy. Composure was strength, and strength was survival. We fell in love slowly, the way people do when neither of them entirely trust the feeling. By the time Adrian proposed, 18 months into the relationship, I believed I finally understood every guarded corner of her. I was wrong about that too, though I would not learn how wrong until much later. The engagement lasted 7 months before it ended. Adrian never gave me a full explanation at the time, only that she needed distance, that being with me was forcing choices in her family she wasn't ready to make. I had been too proud and too hurt to demand more than that. I packed my things out of the apartment we shared and told myself I would rather lose her than beg for a reason. 3 weeks after the breakup, before I even knew I was carrying a life we had created together during the last good months of that relationship, I received the first of what I would later learn was a series of altered communications, this one informing me, falsely, that Adrian had requested no further contact regarding shared fertility records. I had been too devastated to question the tone of a letter that didn't sound like her at all. I understand now that Evelyn Vale had been managing the disintegration of our relationship long before either Adrian or I understood we were being managed. The morning after the gala, once Feld's team finished the full echocardiogram, I asked to see the images myself. I am not a doctor, but I have learned, over 9 years of investigative work, that looking directly at primary evidence teaches you things summaries never will. Feld walked me through the 4 chambers, the electrical pathway highlighted in false color, patient with my questions in a way that made it clear he understood exactly how frightened I was underneath my reporter's calm. The variant she carries prolongs the heart's electrical recovery time, he explained. Under normal conditions, it is manageable, sometimes even undetectable without genetic testing. Under acute stress, extreme temperature change, certain medications, it can trigger a dangerous arrhythmia. The Vale family has documented cases going back 3 generations, according to Dr. Vale's own published research. So this is why she recognized it in the ballroom, I said. Not by guessing, by knowing exactly what to listen for. She would have heard that specific irregular skip 100 times in family members she loves. Feld said gently. It would be like recognizing a relative's voice in a crowded room. That detail settled something in me I hadn't realized was still unsettled. Whatever else had happened, whatever lies had been built around us, that moment in the ballroom had been real. Adrian had not performed recognition. She had simply, helplessly, known. It made the betrayal of the forged documents harder to carry, not easier, because it meant the version of Adrian, who loved that unborn child instantly and instinctively, had existed the entire 2 years I believed she wanted nothing to do with either of us. Adrian and I fell into an uneasy rhythm over the following days, meeting in hospital conference rooms and quiet corners of the cafeteria, building a shared timeline the way 2 skilled professionals build a case file when they have no other language left for what they are actually feeling. She brought printouts. I brought my own research notes. We built a corkboard of dates and documents in an unused consultation room that Dr. Osei quietly allowed us to commandeer, understanding, I think, that some patients needed answers as urgently as they needed medicine. I keep coming back to the timing, Adrian said one afternoon, tapping a date on the board. My mother's assistant changed my email forwarding rule the same week I told my mother, in confidence, that I was considering leaving the hospital system to start an independent pediatric cardiac practice. I thought at the time she was simply upset about the business implications. I didn't understand until now that she may have seen the two things as connected. If I left, and you and I reconciled, and a child existed who could someday inherit both my research and your investigative instincts, she would have had far less control over either of us. You think she planned this specifically to keep you from starting your own practice, I said. I think my mother has never in her life separated love from leverage, Adrian said, and there was an old, tired grief in her voice that told me this insight had cost her something to say out loud. I used to think that made her strong. I'm starting to understand it only ever made her afraid. I did not offer comfort. I was not ready to offer comfort, but I did not argue with her either, and for the two of us, in that moment, that quiet absence of an argument was its own kind of progress. The next morning brought a complication neither of us had anticipated. A hospital compliance officer, a nervous young man named Desmond Ruiz, approached Adrian privately to say he had noticed unusual account activity months earlier and had reported it through internal channels, only to be told the matter had been reviewed and closed. He had kept a personal log out of professional caution, the kind of quiet paper trail people build when they suspect they might need to defend themselves someday. When he learned, through hospital gossip, that Adrian was quietly investigating irregularities in her own department, he decided the risk of coming forward was smaller than the risk of staying silent. His log included timestamps that placed Evelyn's executive assistant logging into archived clinic accounts on evenings and weekends, well outside any legitimate compliance review schedule. It included a partial email thread, forwarded to him by mistake before someone realized the error, discussing the trust clause tied to Adrian's future biological children in explicit financial terms. We finally had a second, independent source corroborating what the storage locker recording suggested. It was no longer only my word and Adrian's suspicion. It was becoming a documented pattern. I could lose my job for showing you this, Ruiz admitted, hands shoved deep in his pockets. But I have a daughter too. I keep thinking about what I'd want someone to do if it were her file being altered. Adrian thanked him with a steadiness I suspected cost her considerable effort, and promised him, without hesitation, that whatever came next, his cooperation would be protected. It was the first time I watched her use her own authority within the hospital not to shield her family, but to shield someone outside it who had chosen honesty at personal risk. I noted it quietly, the way I noted every small piece of evidence that the woman standing in front of me might actually be different from the family that raised her. Feld's team ran the full workup at 7 the next morning, and by 9, Adrian and I were sitting across from each other in a small consultation room, reviewing conflicting timelines like two detectives who happened to share custody of the case file. Her records showed my embryo transfer failing in February. My records, the ones from the fertility clinic I had used independently after our engagement ended, showed a successful transfer in that exact window and a documented pregnancy confirmation 2 weeks later, sent by certified electronic delivery to an email address that belonged to Adrian's old clinic account. That account was deactivated when I moved departments, Adrian said, staring at the delivery confirmation. Deactivated, but the forwarding rule should have redirected everything to my current address automatically, unless someone changed the forwarding rule. Who has access to change something like that? IT administration, she said, or someone with administrative override. My mother has administrative override on every account in this hospital system. It was part of the merger agreement when she took over as board chair. I watched her say it. I watched the specific kind of pain that comes from accusing your own mother sit behind her eyes even as her voice stayed level. I'm not saying she did this, Adrian said. I'm saying she is one of perhaps 4 people who could have. We spent that afternoon mapping the hospital's administrative structure, the way I would map a corporate org chart for an investigation, identifying every person who theoretically had the access required to alter a forwarding rule, forge a signature, or bury a compliance report. The list was short. Evelyn Vale sat at the top of it, but beneath her were exactly 3 names. An IT director who had worked for the family for over a decade, a senior compliance officer, and Evelyn's longtime executive assistant, a woman named Cheryl Boone. "I've known Cheryl since I was 12, Adrian said, staring at the name on the whiteboard we'd claimed. "She used to bring me hot chocolate when I studied in my mother's office after school. I don't want to believe she'd participate in something like this willingly." "People don't always participate willingly," I said. "Sometimes they participate because refusing costs them a job they've held for 20 years, or a pension, or a sense of loyalty that's been cultivated so carefully they can't tell the difference between loyalty and fear anymore." Adrian looked at me for a long moment. "You sound like you're describing someone specific." "I'm describing every source I've ever worked with who eventually told me the truth," I said. "Nobody breaks a silence like this because it's easy. They break it because staying silent finally becomes harder than the alternative." That observation turned out to be more prophetic than either of us understood at the time, though neither of us knew yet how directly it would apply to Desmond Ruiz within the week. We spent the next several hours pulling every version of every document either of us had. The forged transfer failure letter, the intercepted pregnancy confirmation, the parental rights waiver, bearing Adrian's signature, which she insisted, and a preliminary handwriting comparison from a document examiner I called in favor, from suggested, was a highly competent forgery, rather than her own hand. Every piece of evidence pointed the same direction, and none of it, alone, was enough to prove anything in a courtroom. What I didn't expect was the whistleblower's second message, arriving just after noon, this time with an attachment. It was a photograph of a locker, number 114, at a self-storage facility 20 minutes from the hospital, along with a 6-digit code and 4 words. "Everything you need. Hurry." I looked up at Adrian. "I have to go." "Then I'm driving," she said, already reaching for her coat, and when I opened my mouth to argue that I didn't need her protection, she added, quietly, "I'm not asking permission to worry about you. Only to come with you while I do it." I let her drive. The storage facility was the kind of place that exists specifically so no one asks questions. Rows of identical metal doors under buzzing lights. No employee visible anywhere. Locker 114 was near the back, and my hands were shaking hard enough that Adrian had to enter the code for me. Inside was a single banker's box. Inside the box was an old digital voice recorder, the kind clinics used before everything went electronic, along with a thin folder of printed emails. Before we listened to anything, I photographed every item in the box exactly as we found it, the way I had been trained to document evidence a decade earlier by an editor who had watched too many good stories collapse under a defense attorney's chain of custody objection. Adrian watched me work without saying anything, and I noticed, not for the first time, that she seemed almost relieved to let someone else take the lead on something. I think she had spent her whole life being the person in the room who was expected to have every answer, and some quiet part of her did not know what to do with a problem she couldn't solve through expertise alone. The printed emails in the folder were dated across an 11-month span, most of them mundane hospital scheduling correspondence that seemed included only to establish the authenticity of the account they came from. Buried on page 14 was a single thread that made my stomach drop. It was an internal memo from Evelyn Vale to hospital counsel, marked privileged and confidential, discussing what it called contingency planning around the Vale Family Trust in the event of, and I remember the exact phrase, changed family circumstances involving Dr. A. Vale. "That's dated 4 months before our engagement ended," Adrian said, reading over my shoulder, her voice gone thin. "She was already planning around the possibility of a child before I even knew you were pregnant, before I knew anything. She knew before you did, I said quietly. Adrian didn't answer. She simply reached for the recorder, with hands that had gone very still, the particular stillness of someone holding themselves together through sheer will. We sat in Adrian's car in the parking lot and listened to the recorder together. The audio was rough, clearly recorded in secret, but the voice on it was unmistakable even to me, and utterly devastating to Adrian. It was Evelyn Vale, speaking to someone whose voice had been mostly cut off in the recording, discussing a trust clause that would activate the moment Adrian had a biological heir, transferring controlling interest in the hospital network's cardiac division out of Evelyn's hands and into a joint arrangement between Adrian and that heir's other parent. If the cross woman's pregnancy becomes a matter of record before the transfer clause expires, Evelyn's voice said, flat and businesslike, I lose the division. I am not losing 30 years of work to sentiment. Adrian does not need to know anything until it no longer matters. Adrian turned the recorder off with a hand that had gone completely white around the knuckles. Neither of us spoke for a long moment. She didn't just intercept records, Adrian finally said. She built an entire second reality to keep us apart, because keeping us apart protected her control over the division I've spent my whole career trying to build. Adrian, I said carefully, because I needed her to hear this next part without flinching away from it. I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. She looked at me. You said you never saw the waiver, never saw my pregnancy confirmation, never knew any of this was happening. I believe that now, but 8 months ago, before any of this, did you ever notice anything strange? Any small inconsistency you let go because looking closer felt too dangerous? I watched the question land somewhere deep in her, somewhere she clearly hadn't wanted to go. There were things, she admitted slowly. A locked file drawer in my mother's office that used my old caseload numbers on the label. A conversation I overheard between her and hospital counsel that stopped the second I walked in. A comment my mother made once about how the fertility program's outcomes tracked embryos more carefully than the hospital's own compliance system that never quite sat right with me. She looked down at her hands. I told myself it wasn't my business. I told myself that if I asked too many questions, she would use it as an excuse to shut down the pediatric cardiac program, the one that treats children exactly like our daughter is going to need. I told myself I was protecting hundreds of kids by staying quiet. Her voice cracked, just slightly, on the last sentence. I didn't create this lie, Lena, but I let it live, because looking at it directly felt too expensive. That is not the same as innocence. I understand if it isn't enough for you. I sat with that for a long time before I answered her, because I didn't want to give her comfort she hadn't earned, and I didn't want to punish her for honesty either. It isn't nothing, I finally said. You should have looked closer. You should have asked. But you are looking now, and you are telling me the truth even when it makes you look weak instead of noble, and that is worth something to me. I'm not offering you forgiveness. I'm offering you the chance to keep being honest and see where that gets us. She nodded once, like a woman accepting a verdict she thought was fair. We drove back to the hospital in a silence that felt different from the silence of the past 2 years, less like a wall and more like two people carrying the same weight from opposite ends. The days that followed moved fast in some ways and painfully slow in others. Feld's team confirmed that our daughter carried the dangerous variant of the Vale cadence, the kind that could destabilize under acute stress, which meant every week of the pregnancy now came with a level of monitoring that made my hands shake every time a new appointment appeared on my calendar. Adrian attended every single one, always asking before she reached for the monitor, always asking before she sat closer than I'd invited her to sit, 3 separate times over those 2 weeks, saying only, quietly, "May I?" before I answered. I noticed she never once tried to use our shared history, or the baby, or the fact that she was the one who had recognized the danger in that ballroom, as leverage to reclaim territory in my life she had lost. She earned every inch of proximity by asking for it and accepting the answer, whatever it was. It made the wall around my anger harder to maintain than I wanted it to be. The document examiner's full report came back confirming what we already suspected. The parental rights waiver was a forgery, built from a genuine signature Adrian had provided on an unrelated hospital form, digitally lifted and grafted onto a fabricated document. The transfer failure letter showed clear evidence of alteration in its metadata. The forwarding rule on Adrian's old clinic email had been changed by an administrative account that traced back to Evelyn Vale's executive assistant, though not, notably, to Evelyn's own login, a gap her lawyers would later call plausible deniability, and I would call exactly what it was designed to be. We had enough for a lawsuit. We did not yet have enough to stop what Evelyn tried next. In the days between the storage locker and Evelyn's first approach, Adrian and I fell into something I hadn't expected, a fragile, careful companionship built entirely around the baby's care and the investigation, but with small cracks of the old warmth showing through in unguarded moments. She started bringing me the specific ginger tea I used to drink during my first trimester with our earlier, unsuccessful attempts, without me ever mentioning I still craved it. I caught myself, twice, reaching for her hand during a difficult ultrasound, before remembering I hadn't decided yet whether I was allowed to want that comfort from her. She never took the reaching for granted. Both times, she let her fingers close gently around mine, then asked, quietly, whether I wanted her to let go once the moment passed, giving me the choice instead of assuming the answer. "You don't have to keep asking me that," I told her once, more sharply than I intended, exhausted from weeks of medical appointments and unraveling conspiracy. "I know you're trying to respect my boundaries. I believe you. You can stop treating me like glass." Adrian considered that for a moment. "I'm not asking because I think you're fragile," she said. "I'm asking because for 2 years I made choices about our life together without checking whether they were choices you actually wanted. I told myself I was protecting you from my family's politics by creating distance you never agreed to. I don't ever want to make a decision that big about your life again without your voice in the room. Even small decisions. Especially small decisions. That's not about you being fragile, Lena. That's about me finally understanding what I broke." It was the closest she had come to describing, in plain terms, the actual failure at the center of our broken engagement, not her mother's manipulation, but her own instinct to protect people by deciding things for them instead of with them. I filed the admission away carefully, the way I filed away every piece of evidence that mattered. She requested a private meeting with me alone, no lawyers, no Adrian, at a restaurant far enough from the hospital that no one from the board would recognize either of us. I told Adrian I was going. She wanted to come, I asked her not to, and for the first time since the ballroom, I watched her override every instinct that told her to protect me by force, and simply say, "Call me the second it's over." Evelyn Vale was, in person, nothing like the calculating voice on that recorder. She was warm, articulate, the kind of woman who made you feel briefly important simply by looking at you directly while she spoke. "I want to be clear that I never wished harm on you, or the child," she said, once the pleasantries were finished. "I made a business decision under difficult circumstances. I am prepared to make this right in a way that protects everyone, including my granddaughter." "By granddaughter, you mean the trust clause," I said. Her expression didn't change, which told me more than words could have. "I am prepared to offer you lifetime medical coverage for the child, a generous settlement, complete privacy protection for your career, on the condition that this remains a private family matter. I would also require sole administrative control of the trust established in her name, held independently, until she reaches adulthood, to ensure it is managed responsibly, rather than becoming a pressure point in whatever remains of your relationship with my daughter. You want me to stay quiet and hand you control of my daughter's money in exchange for insurance," I said. "I want to protect a hospital system that treats 400 children a year, Evelyn said, and I believed, uncomfortably, that she meant it. I am not the villain in this the way you'd like me to be, Ms. Cross. I am a woman who has spent 30 years building something fragile, and I will do what is necessary to keep it standing. I told her I needed time to think it over. I smiled. I thanked her for the offer. I want to describe that lunch in more detail, because I think it matters how ordinary it felt while it was happening. Evelyn Vale ordered a salad and a sparkling water. She asked about my due date with what seemed like genuine warmth. She mentioned, almost in passing, a wing of the children's hospital named after her late husband, and the specific joy she took in watching families walk through its doors, knowing their care was covered regardless of ability to pay. She was not lying about that part. I have since confirmed the charitable foundation she built is real, well-funded, and has genuinely helped thousands of families. That was, I think, the most unsettling part of sitting across from her. She was not a cartoon villain twirling a mustache over stolen documents. She was a woman entirely capable of real generosity who had also, without apparent contradiction in her own mind, been willing to destroy her daughter's family to protect her control over an institution she genuinely believed only she could steward correctly. You strike me as someone who understands difficult trade-offs, Evelyn said, cutting into her salad with the same precision I'd seen in Adrian 100 times, and I understood in that moment exactly where her daughter had learned her composure. Every institution that does real good in this world is built by someone willing to make choices that look cold from the outside. I built the cardiac program that will treat your daughter's condition. I built the trauma wing that has saved this city's children for 2 decades. I am not going to apologize for protecting what I built, even if the way I protected it looks unkind to you right now. You separated 2 people who loved each other, I said. You let me believe, for 2 years, that the woman I was engaged to didn't want our child. I made a calculation, Evelyn said, and her voice never once rose. I calculated that a temporary, painful separation was less damaging than the alternative, which was watching my daughter walk away from 30 years of institutional stability the moment she fell in love with an outsider who had no stake in preserving it. I was wrong about how painful the separation would become. I underestimated how long it would take the 2 of you to find your way back to each other, if you even have. But I want to be honest with you, Ms. Cross, because I think you respect honesty more than performance. I would make the same calculation again today, under the same information. I simply hope, now that circumstances have changed, that we can find an arrangement that costs less than the one I originally chose. I remember thinking, sitting there with my hand resting on the curve of my stomach, that this was the most dangerous kind of person I had ever interviewed in 9 years of investigative work. Not someone who believed she was righteous, despite the harm she caused, but someone who understood the harm completely and had simply decided, with full clarity, that it was an acceptable price. Then I called my producer, Naveen, from the restaurant bathroom and asked him whether the recorder from the storage locker could be authenticated well enough to broadcast, and whether he could get me into that restaurant with a second, live microphone for the follow-up meeting Evelyn had already suggested we schedule to finalize terms. He could, he did. I spent the 3 days before that second meeting preparing in a way I had never prepared for a story before, because for the first time in my career, the outcome mattered to me in a way that had nothing to do with a byline. I met with my attorney, a sharp, unflappable woman named Priya Chandran who specialized in family and reproductive law, and walked her through every document, every timestamp, every piece of the timeline Adrian and I had built. Priya confirmed what I suspected. Between the forged waiver, the intercepted records, and Ruiz's internal compliance log, we likely had grounds not only for a civil suit, but for a criminal referral for records fraud and tampering with protected health information. The recording from the storage locker helps, Priya said, but a recording obtained secretly by a third party, with unclear chain of custody, could face admissibility challenges. If you can get her to restate the same admissions directly to you, in a conversation you record yourself, with proper consent under this state's one-party consent law, you strengthen the case significantly and you remove any question about where the storage locker recording came from. I told her I could get Evelyn to talk. I had spent 9 years learning exactly how to get powerful people to talk. Adrian wanted to be there. I told her no, and I watched it cost her something to accept that answer without argument. She'll be more careful if you're in the room, I explained. She sees me as someone she can still manage with money and reassurance. She sees you as someone she has to manage with guilt and family loyalty. I need her relaxed, not calculating. I can only get that if it's just the two of us. Then let me be outside, Adrian said. Not in the room, not visible. But close enough that if something goes wrong, I'm not 20 minutes away not knowing. I agreed to that. It felt, oddly, like the first real compromise either of us had negotiated since the ballroom, two people learning to balance protection against autonomy, instead of one simply overriding the other. 3 days later, I sat across from Evelyn Vale again, wearing a blouse with a microphone stitched into the collar seam. My producer parked outside in a van with recording equipment, and, at my insistence, a direct line opened to my legal counsel in case anything went wrong. Adrian sat 2 blocks away in a parked car, phone in hand, having promised me 3 times that she would not come inside unless I texted a single word we'd agreed on in advance. I told Evelyn I would accept her offer. I watched relief loosen something in her shoulders that had been tight since our first meeting. I only need one thing clarified before I sign anything, I said. I need to understand exactly what happened, in your own words, so my lawyers can draft language that protects both of us from future disputes. Walk me through it. From the beginning. People who believe they have already won tend to talk more than they should. Evelyn Vale was no exception. Over the next 11 minutes, with the calm precision of a woman describing a successful business strategy rather than a crime, she confirmed intercepting my pregnancy confirmation, redirecting Adrian's email, forging the transfer failure letter, and instructing her assistant to alter the parental rights document using a signature lifted from an unrelated hospital form. She said Adrian's ignorance had made the entire plan easier to execute, describing her own daughter's trust and integrity as, in her words, a useful weakness. That was the sentence that cost her everything. I felt the first real contraction of the afternoon, right as she finished speaking, sharp and sudden, and entirely unrelated to anything I had planned for that meeting. I kept my face steady long enough to thank her for her honesty and excuse myself to the restroom, where I texted Naveen one word, "Go," before the second contraction dropped me to the tile floor. The recording was still uploading to our secure server when my water broke in the back of an ambulance 20 minutes later, 6 weeks earlier than anyone had planned for, my body apparently deciding it had run out of patience for waiting on the rest of us to finish our reckoning. I called Adrian from the ambulance. I don't remember most of what I said. I remember she was already moving before I finished the sentence, because I could hear car doors and traffic and her own breathing gone fast and controlled, in the specific way of someone forcing calm onto a body that wanted to panic. "I'm coming," she said. "Lena, listen to me. Whatever you need when I get there, tell me, and I will do exactly that and nothing else. Do you understand?" I understood. I think it was the first time in 2 years I had fully believed a promise from her. By the time I reached the hospital, Adrian had already done something I did not learn about until much later. She had walked directly out of an emergency board session, called to address the leaked recording that Naveen's outlet had already begun to publish in excerpted form. She had stood in front of the same board that controlled her career, her research funding, and her mother's legacy, and resigned her position on the executive committee on the spot, stating plainly that she would not sit on a board chaired by someone under active investigation for medical fraud and records tampering, family or not. Then she came to the delivery room and asked Dr. Osei's independent team, not her own department, to lead my care, because she said she did not trust herself to be objective, and did not want anyone in that room owing loyalty to her mother, instead of to her daughter. I should tell you what those 6 hours actually felt like from the inside, because the calm way I've described everything up to now does not capture it honestly. Premature labor at 31 weeks is its own kind of war. The contractions came faster than my body was prepared for, and underneath every wave of pain was a colder fear, the specific fear of a mother who has spent 2 weeks learning exactly how dangerous her daughter's heart condition could become under acute stress, watching the monitor for the arrhythmia we had all been dreading. Dr. Osei's team moved with the practiced urgency of people who had done this 100 times, but I could see, in the tightness around their eyes, that a cardiac-compromised premature delivery was not routine for any of them. Feld arrived within 11 minutes of Adrian's call, still in the clothes he'd been wearing at home, hair uncombed, already reviewing my chart on a tablet as he walked through the door. She stood at my shoulder for 6 of the hardest hours of my life. She asked, before every touch. She held my hand only when I reached for hers first. When the delivery team's monitor caught the first dangerous arrhythmia in our daughter's heartbeat, the exact variant of the Vale cadence we had spent 2 weeks preparing for, Adrian did not take over. She stood beside Feld's team, answering questions when asked, offering expertise only when invited, watching the daughter she had known about for exactly 17 days fight for a stable rhythm, with a stillness that I understood, later, had cost her everything she had. The delivery room went quiet in the worst possible way, just before the final push, the kind of quiet that exists only in hospitals, machines holding their breath along with the people around them. Adrian stopped breathing before I did. I found out afterward that in that silence, she had gripped the edge of the bedrail hard enough to leave marks in her palm, and had not said a single word, because she had promised me she would only do what I asked, and in that moment what I needed most was for someone in the room to stay steady enough that I could fall apart without both of us falling at once. Our daughter was born 4 minutes later, small, furious, and screaming loud enough that 3 separate nurses laughed out of pure relief. Her heart rhythm stabilized within the hour. Evelyn Vale's confession, along with corroborating evidence Naveen's investigative team had independently verified over the previous 2 weeks, went fully public within days, triggering both a hospital board investigation and a criminal referral for records fraud. Evelyn resigned as chair before the board could force the vote. Adrian did not attend the press conference where her mother's resignation was announced, choosing instead to sit in the neonatal unit beside an incubator, watching a heart monitor with a rhythm she now recognized as clearly as her own pulse. When I was finally strong enough to have the conversation I had been avoiding, I asked her the only question that mattered. What do you want from this? From me? From her? Now that everything is public, and your mother has lost everything, and you could have walked away with your name cleared and your reputation intact. Adrian thought about the question longer than I expected. I don't want anything from you that you haven't already chosen to give me, she said. I'm not asking for forgiveness, because I don't think forgiveness is something anyone can ask for honestly. I'm not asking to reclaim the engagement, because that relationship ended for reasons that had nothing to do with my mother's lies, reasons that were entirely mine, about how much of myself I was willing to hide from you to keep peace in my family. I only want to know whether our daughter is safe, whether you are safe, and whether there is room, someday, for me to become something to both of you that isn't defined by biology or by guilt. I told her I didn't know yet. I told her that was the most honest answer I had. She nodded, and said the words I would come to understand, months later, were the ones that finally began rebuilding what her family had spent 2 years destroying. Then I'll wait for whatever answer is true, instead of the one that's convenient for me. The months that followed did not move like a fairy tale. They moved like real recovery, slow and uneven, full of setbacks that had nothing to do with villains and everything to do with two people learning how to trust each other in the ordinary, unglamorous ways that actually hold a relationship together. We went to counseling separately at first, then together, twice a month, in a small office that had nothing to do with either of our family's money or reputation. Adrienne talked, for the first time in her adult life, about what it had cost her to be raised as her mother's successor, trained from childhood to protect the institution above the individuals inside it, taught that silence in service of a larger good was a virtue rather than a failure of courage. I talked about what it had cost me to build a career on exposing other people's secrets while keeping my own heart locked in a drawer, about how much easier it had been to believe the worst of Adrienne than to sit with the possibility that we had both been failed by the same lie. We built a co-parenting plan slowly, with our own lawyers, independent of anything Evelyn's trust clause had ever tried to force on us. Adrienne moved into an apartment 8 minutes from mine, close enough for the daily logistics of a newborn with a cardiac condition that required careful monitoring, far enough that neither of us mistook proximity for entitlement. Our counselor, a soft-spoken woman named Dr. Halverson, who specialized in families rebuilding trust after betrayal, told us early on that the mistake most couples make after a crisis like ours is trying to skip straight to the reconciliation without doing the slower work of understanding exactly what broke and why. She asked us, in one of our earliest sessions, to each describe the moment we first knew something in our relationship had gone wrong, independent of Evelyn's interference. Adrienne answered first, which surprised me, because for 2 years she had been the one who deflected these questions with clinical distance. 8 months before the engagement ended, she said, Lena asked me to come to her cousin's wedding as her fiancé, publicly, in front of extended family who didn't know our relationship yet. I told her I had a surgical rotation I couldn't miss. That was true. What I didn't tell her was that I had also quietly asked to be assigned that rotation, because I was afraid of what it would mean to stand in a room as her partner, permanently, visibly, in a way my mother could never later pretend not to have known about. I chose the hospital over her, not because the hospital needed me more, but because visibility terrified me. I never told her that. I let her believe I simply had bad timing. I hadn't known that. I sat with it for a long moment, feeling old hurt and new understanding arrive at the same time, which is its own particular kind of disorienting. I remember that, I said slowly. I remember telling myself it didn't mean anything, that doctors miss things all the time. But some part of me filed it away, as proof that I mattered less to you than your career did. I think I spent the rest of the relationship testing that theory, without ever saying it out loud, picking small fights about time and attention that were really about that one missed wedding. You were testing something true, Adrienne admitted. I was hiding from my own life, and you paid the price for my hiding, long before my mother ever touched a single document. Dr. Halverson let that sit in the room for a while before speaking again. This is useful, she said, because it tells me the crisis with your daughter's records didn't create the fracture in this relationship. It exposed one that already existed. Evelyn Vale is responsible for the specific harm she caused, deliberately and with real malice. But if the two of you want something real going forward, you'll need to do more than solve the mystery of what she did. You'll need to solve the mystery of what the two of you were already avoiding before she ever touched a single document. That session became the template for most of the ones that followed. We stopped treating our reconciliation as a single dramatic act of forgiveness and started treating it as a long series of small, unglamorous conversations about the ordinary ways we had failed to be honest with each other long before Evelyn's interference gave us a more dramatic villain to blame. I told Adrienne, in one particularly difficult session, that I had gone into our relationship already braced for her to leave, because every serious relationship in my life before her had ended the same way, with someone deciding I was too much, too intense, too unwilling to let a story go, once I'd started pulling a thread. I told her I think I had, in some ways, been waiting for her to prove that theory right, and that when the forged documents arrived, some old, wounded part of me had almost been relieved, because it meant I could stop hoping she was different from everyone who came before her. Adrian cried during that session, which I had seen her do exactly twice before in 4 years, once at her father's funeral and once in the delivery room. She told me that hearing me describe waiting for her to leave broke something open in her, because she realized her own instinct to protect people by making decisions for them, the instinct that had led her to hide the wedding rotation and later to stay silent about her suspicions regarding her mother, had likely confirmed every fear I carried into our relationship without either of us ever naming it directly. "I kept trying to be steady for you," she said. "I didn't understand that being steady and being honest are not always the same thing. Sometimes what looked like strength to me looked like distance to you, and I never asked which one you actually needed. We built new habits slowly, out of sessions like that one. We started a practice Dr. Halverson called a weekly accounting, 15 minutes every Sunday evening, where each of us named one moment that week we had wanted to hide something small from the other, and chose honesty instead. In the beginning, the moments we named were almost embarrassingly minor: a missed phone call, an unspoken worry about money, a flash of old resentment neither of us acted on. Over time, the practice became less about the content and more about proving, week after week, that we could choose transparency even when it cost us something small, so that when something larger eventually tested us again, and Dr. Halverson was clear that it eventually would, we would already have the muscle memory of choosing truth over comfort. She came to every appointment. She learned to change a feeding tube with the same careful precision she used in surgery. She asked, every single time, before she picked our daughter up from her bassinet, even on the mornings when I was too exhausted to answer, and simply nodded from across the room. I watched her earn, day by unglamorous day, the trust her mother's lies had stolen from both of us before either of us had a say in it. There were nights I still woke up angry, replaying the 2 years I had spent believing she had abandoned us by choice. There were nights she called me, quietly ashamed, to admit some small piece of the old silence she had let live in her family for too long, a memory she'd suppressed, a moment she should have pushed harder and hadn't. I did not let those admissions erase what she had lost by finally telling the truth. I also did not let my old anger erase what it cost her to keep choosing honesty when silence would have been easier every single time. Evelyn Vale's criminal case moved slowly through the system, the way these things do when the accused can afford attorneys skilled at delay. She eventually accepted a plea agreement that avoided a public trial in exchange for a lengthy probation, a permanent bar from any hospital administrative role, and a court-ordered restitution fund that Priya structured, at Adrian's insistence, to go directly toward the pediatric cardiac program Evelyn had once used as leverage against both of us. Adrian told me once, quietly, that she thought her mother would hate that particular condition more than any prison sentence could have hurt her, watching the program she'd tried to weaponize become permanently, legally protected from ever being weaponized again. I did not attend the sentencing hearing. Adrian did, alone, and told me afterward only that her mother had not looked at her once during the proceedings. I did not ask her how that felt. Some grief does not need narration. Naveen's investigative series ran as a 3-part feature, carefully fact-checked, legally reviewed, and, notably, framed around the systemic vulnerabilities in hospital records compliance rather than around Adrian or our relationship. A choice I insisted on, and one Naveen respected without argument. Ruiz was protected exactly as promised, his cooperation ultimately leading to hospital-wide reforms in administrative account oversight that a compliance consultant later told me were being studied by 2 other regional hospital networks. Jay, our original whistleblower, revealed themselves 6 weeks after our daughter's birth. It was Desmond Ruiz's cousin, a records clerk in a neighboring department, who had noticed the same irregularities Ruiz had, and, lacking his direct access, had instead spent months quietly gathering what she could and searching for a journalist she trusted to take the risk seriously. I met her for coffee once the legal dust settled. She cried when she saw a photograph of our daughter, healthy, home, sleeping in her bassinet. She said it was the first time since she'd started digging that she let herself believe the risk had been worth taking. I think about that a great deal, still. How much of what saved my daughter's life came down to strangers deciding, independently and at real personal cost, that the truth mattered more than their own safety. I try to remember that, whenever the exhaustion of new parenthood makes it easy to forget how close we came to a very different ending. By the time our daughter turned 4 months old, strong enough that her cardiologist finally downgraded her monitoring schedule from weekly to monthly, something between Adrienne and I had shifted into a shape neither of us tried to name too quickly. She still asked before she touched me. I still decided, every time, what I was ready to allow. On an ordinary Tuesday evening, nothing about it special, except that our daughter had slept through her first full night without an alarm, I found Adrienne standing in my kitchen, making tea she had learned I liked during the 22 months we had once lived together. And something in the domestic ease of it undid the last of the wall I had been keeping between us. I did not propose an engagement. I did not offer a wedding. I offered her something smaller, and, I think now, more honest. I handed her a key to my front door. "This isn't the ring back," I told her. "This isn't pretending the last 2 years didn't happen. This is me telling you that I want you in this house on ordinary days, not just emergency ones. I want to build something new with you, slowly, the way we should have built the first thing, instead of assuming love was enough proof that we understood each other." Adrienne looked at the key, like it weighed more than anything her family's name had ever handed her. She turned it over once in her palm, and I watched her do something I had rarely seen her do even in our most intimate moments together. She let her composure fall away completely. No careful alpha stillness, no measured breath, just a woman standing in a kitchen holding a small piece of metal like it was the only thing that had ever mattered. "When I was young," she said, "my mother used to tell me that keys were dangerous things, because they gave people access to parts of your life you couldn't fully control once you handed them over." She meant it as a warning. I think I absorbed that warning more deeply than either of us realized, because for years I mistook withholding access for protecting the people I loved, when really, I was only protecting myself from the risk of being truly known, and someday found wanting. "And now?" I asked. "Now I think my mother had it backwards," Adrienne said. "The danger was never in giving someone a key. The danger was in never giving anyone one at all, and calling that safety instead of what it actually was, which was loneliness dressed up as strength." "I will not waste this," she said. I believed her, not because her voice broke on the words, though it did, but because of everything she had already done in the 4 months before she said them. The first heartbeat had told Adrienne whose blood our daughter carried. Everything that came afterward taught us something harder. Blood could reveal a connection, but only honesty, patience, and choice could turn that connection into a family. If you believe love should be earned through actions rather than claimed through biology, subscribe for the next GL romance.